Morning. My name is Ron Allen, and I arrived here this morning all wired, and that I understand that my eminent technician tells me that if you have sidebar conversations that they're going to be recorded for posterity. So I guess I'd ask if you could keep the sidebar conversations down, because I guess every mic is open here. Now, once upon a time I saw Jack Anderson. I don't, most of you probably, younger people probably don't remember Jack Anderson, but he was the gossip columnist type of person, very controversial, and I once went to a speech that Anderson gave, and he leaned over at the very beginning and he says, "It's nice to see a microphone that I can talk into." He had indeed been himself oftentimes recorded when he didn't realize it. But, the other thing I'd ask you to bear with me on is that in my more mature years, I seem to have come across some allergies. So if it gets a little rough, I'd ask you to bear with me. I am Ron Allen, and this is a seminar on the Civil Works Program of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. It is conducted under the auspices of the Chief Counsel, intended specifically to benefit the Corps attorneys who are currently enrolled in the master's program in Environmental and Natural Resources Law at the National Law Center, George Washington University. I am honored that the Chief Counsel, the Deputy Chief Counsel, and these learned master's candidates are with us, and that the rest of us are here today as well, and that the Chief Counsel has selected me to facilitate this seminar. This seminar is scheduled for 3 hours. I will ask you to listen to me for the first hour on the origins and broad principles of the Corps' multiple-purpose Civil Works Development Program. At the conclusion of my presentation, I will propose a 10-minute break, and upon our return from the break, I will turn this proceeding over to my associate, Lance Wood, who is, of course, a scholar of national reputation, able to educate us on any subject, and most assuredly on the origins and broad principles of the Civil Works Regulatory Program. For it will prove that he who is responsible for the development of the waters of the United States for the federal government is also responsible for protecting those waters for the federal government and for regulating the development in those waters by others. It is a tapestry of development and regulation that should weave together when we have the strands. After Lance's presentation, I will propose that Lester Edelman, the Chief Counsel, join Lance and me as a panel where you and we can all have an opportunity for comments and questions, and most importantly, an opportunity to share the thoughts of the Chief Counsel. As most of you are aware, Lester Edelman has been instrumental in his service to the Congress and the Executive in helping to shape and lead the Corps' Civil Works Program in its modern era. So I'm going to start off this proceeding by presuming to tell Lester Edelman what the Civil Works Program is all about. Then I will go teach Michael Jordan how to play basketball. What follows are my views, not necessarily the views of the Corps of Engineers or any other organization or individual. However, I wish to acknowledge substantial assistance from a handful of excellent publications, such as the 1951 Water Resources Law Report of the President's Water Resources Policy Commission, the 1988 publication of the Public Works Historical Society entitled The Flood Control Challenge, Past, Present, and Future, and the 1988 publication of Joseph Arnold entitled The Evolution of the 1936 Flood Control Act. I am also particularly indebted to the authors of a document entitled The United States Constitution. In the beginning, there was no multiple-purpose Civil Works Program of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. There was no United States Army Corps of Engineers, and there was no United States. In the latter part of the 1700s, there was simply discontent and revolution arising in the 13 colonies against Mother England. And at a place today called Bunker Hill in Boston, some of that colonial discontent was violently manifested against the forces of the British King, and the fledgling Revolutionary Army picked an engineer for the Battle of Bunker Hill, who was said to be the first Army Chief of Engineers of the new nation then forming. Sometime after the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston, and prior to the British surrender to the American revolutionaries at Yorktown, Virginia, there was a marvelously capable American fighting man named Benedict Arnold, who turned traitor to the American forces and conveyed the plans to an American fortification known as West Point on the Hudson River, New York, to a Major Andre of the British forces. The British Major Andre is often described in our histories as the dashing Major Andre, but he was not dashing enough to get those plans for West Point from Benedict Arnold to the British Army, and Andre was captured with the plans by the American forces as Andre attempted to make his way through the American lines and to the British forces then occupying New York City. So the dashing Major Andre was executed by the revolutionary forces of this new nation, thereby assuring that Benedict Arnold would spend his retirement years in infamy in England, and this nation would keep West Point to become early on a school for Army officers to be particularly skilled in engineering, and the nation would emerge with a corps of well-trained Army engineers available for military and civil purposes. So there we were in the late 1700s. We beat Cornwallis at Yorktown, and we kept West Point to be a primary source of well-trained engineers for a government of a new United States that was initially formed under Articles of Confederation that were bound to fail. And with the failure of the Articles of Confederation came the formation and adoption of the United States Constitution that Congressman Oberstar so ably and justifiably celebrated for us at our recent Law Day celebration. And it turns out that the then new federal government of the United States at the turn of the 19th century was a government of limited and enumerated powers, and some of which powers nonetheless might prove of increasing importance to a corps of well-trained Army engineers available to help the nation. For example, the United States under the Constitution had the powers to raise and support armies and to declare war, which are certainly fundamental powers to facilitate any Army organization. And for our purposes, the United States had other powers that might prove to be important, such as the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting territory or other property belonging to the United States, the power to provide for the general welfare of the United States, and the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. The new United States Constitution also provided that the United States could make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its powers, and that those federal laws made pursuant to the United States Constitution were to be the supreme law of the land, anything in the laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Nonetheless, the federal government was and remains a government of limited and enumerated powers, as provided in the U.S. Constitution. And you may remember that there was an early struggle between Thomas Jefferson and his followers and Alexander Hamilton and his followers over the power that could or should be exercised by the federal government over the activities of the new nation. Thomas Jefferson and his followers, Madison and Monroe, held the federal executive powers in the early 1800s. And notwithstanding that President Jefferson used his supposed limited powers very liberally to acquire vast new territories for the United States, the Jeffersonians professed a belief in a nation of small farms with a very limited, if not weak, federal government. For example, there were congressional interests who wished the federal government to develop a national system of roads and federally funded navigation improvements in the early 1800s. But those Federalist interests were effectively opposed by the philosophy of very limited federal government of the Jeffersonians. And it is reported that President Madison and President Monroe each in turn vetoed federal measures to accomplish these so-called internal improvements. And a national debate over the proper sphere of the federal government has continued more or less in one form or another from then to now. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, a most interesting statesman, and his views on limited federal powers extended very definitely to the role of the federal judiciary. For example, Mr. Jefferson said the Constitution meant that its coordinate branches should be checks on each other, but the opinion which gives to the judges the right to decide what laws are constitutional and what not only for themselves in their own sphere of action, but for the legislative and executive also in their spheres, would make the judiciary a despotic branch. Thomas Jefferson certainly had one federal judge that he thought of as a despot. And he turned out to be another gentleman from Virginia who was Jefferson's cousin. His name was John Marshall, and he was a Federalist who believed in a strong federal government. And as Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Marshall also believed in a strong federal judiciary. Accordingly, President Jefferson and Chief Justice Marshall had different philosophies on the proper power of the federal government and the judiciary. They were not friendly cousins. You may remember that Chief Justice Marshall tied President Jefferson into knots on the power of the judiciary over the executive in determining a dispute over the rights of an otherwise obscure postmaster named Marbury in a case entitled Marbury versus Madison. You may also remember, as a story for another day, that President Jefferson also despised his own vice president, a man by the name of Aaron Burr, who engaged in a lot of political intrigue and had sharpened his political skills in New York while killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel in New Jersey. President Jefferson did not like his Vice President Burr and took the opportunity of one of Burr's more egregious intrigues to have Burr apprehended and prosecuted for treason against the United States, only to have the case by chance brought before Chief Justice Marshall, sitting as a trial judge on circuit in Richmond. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, further enraged at John Marshall when Marshall refused to convict Aaron Burr of the charge against Burr brought at the insistence of Jefferson. It also seems that John Marshall continued to prevail over the philosophy of Jefferson and Jefferson's followers by outlasting the Jeffersonians and waiting for the right circumstances in the right cases to decide on the side of a strong federal government. For example, in 1824, Thomas Jefferson was in retirement at his home, Monticello, 2 years from his death, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence that he had written for us. And John Marshall was still Chief Justice and presented with a New York State attempt to monopolize certain coastal trade in circumstances that I'm certain must have pleased Chief Justice Marshall to address. Some well-known New York State entrepreneurs named Livingston and Fulton had been granted by New York State statute the exclusive right to navigate steamboats in New York waters. They had in turn assigned their right to navigate between New York City and New Jersey to a man named Ogden. Another man named Gibbons, who was navigating these same waters, was steamboats that had been enrolled and licensed in the coastal trade under an act of the United States Congress, was enjoined by the New York State courts from continuing to operate in those coastal waters, because Mr. Ogden was a successor in right to the New York monopoly on that coastal trade afforded Livingston and Fulton. Chief Justice Marshall rendered the federal decision in the case of Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824 by finding and shaping very broad commerce powers of the federal government that he attributed to the United States Constitution, and thus finding that the New York State monopoly law, to the benefit of Mr. Ogden and the detriment of Mr. Gibbons, was invalid to the extent that it attempted to contravene the commerce power of the federal government. For purposes of our particular story, Chief Justice Marshall said, "All America understands and has uniformly understood the word commerce to comprehend navigation. It was understood and must have been so understood when the Constitution was framed. The power over commerce, including navigation, which was one of the primary objects for which the people of America adopted their government, and must have been contemplated in forming it." Arguments against the legal propriety of the federal government engaging in the protection and improvement of the navigable waters of the United States were therefore effectively overcome in 1824 by the Supreme Court decision in Gibbons versus Ogden. And in that same year, 1824, Congress started long-term employment on navigation improvements for that small corps of Army engineers born at Bunker Hill and subsequently nurtured and educated at West Point. In 1824, Congress authorized the President to cause surveys, plans, and estimates to be made of such roads and canals as he may deem of national importance in a commercial or military point of view or necessary for the transportation of the public mail, and to that end to employ 2 or more skillful civil engineers and, quote, officers of the Corps of Engineers. This authority to employ civil engineers was later repealed, but the employment of the Army engineers for this purpose continued. Thus began the history of internal improvements for navigation to be provided to the rivers, canals, and harbors by an Army Corps of Engineers. And the first 100 years of this history from 1824 to 1924 is evidenced by hundreds of congressional appropriations for such navigation improvements, contained in individual enactments and in collective or omnibus enactments. There are those today who are troubled by the fact that the Corps sometimes now receives authorizations through appropriation enactments. They might take some comfort in understanding that for the first 100 years of the Civil Works program, the only authorizations that the Corps received were appropriations. Congress appropriated the money for the navigation improvement, and the Corps of Engineers did the work. I speculate that the early 1800s may also have marked the beginning of a generally good and special relationship between the Corps of Engineers and the Congress, where the Congress came to trust the Corps as an apolitical, highly efficient, well-trained, and disciplined agency that was willing to listen to and respond to the Congress and would carry out the wishes of Congress when properly expressed. With the advent of the federal internal improvements also came charges of undesirable investments due to practices attributed to the Congress and styled as log rolling or pork barrel politics. In early partial response to these charges, the Congress created in 1879 a Mississippi River Commission to consist of Corps of Engineers, officers, and civilians from private life to oversee the planning and reporting of improvements on the Mississippi River. And the Congress created in 1902 a Board of Engineers for Rivers and Harbors to consist of Corps of Engineers officers to oversee the planning and reporting of all rivers and harbors improvements. The Mississippi River Commission is still in existence to perform its statutory review and reporting functions. The Board of Engineers for Rivers and Harbors was abolished a few years ago with the agreement of the Congress and the executive that the board had outlived its usefulness. Time will tell on the wisdom of abolishing the Board of Engineers for Rivers and Harbors and the continued viability of the Mississippi River Commission. Speaking of the Mississippi River, I find it appropriate to note at this point that the history of the Corps of Engineers Civil Works program is certainly a nationwide history of involvement, but it is also very much a national history of the Mississippi River. And the nation, the Corps, and the Mississippi River have a special relationship. This special relationship with the Mississippi River might be attributed at any moment to the influence of politically astute congressmen from the Mississippi River states. But historically, this special relationship with the Mississippi seems attributable to the fact that the Mississippi River was the nation's highway for goods and services before the nation had any other national highways. The Mississippi River is huge, our largest river that drains much of the nation's watersheds and came to be viewed almost as federal property for administration under the constitutional power of the Congress to rule the property of the United States. Be that as it may be, on the Mississippi River, the Corps of Engineers has a long and productive history of navigation improvements on the Mississippi and elsewhere throughout the nation, the inland waterways of the United States, big and small, its harbors, big and small. A history of waterways provided by federal statutes and specifying that they should remain free of charge for use by the public, and facilitated on the inland waterways with dredging, levees, locks and dams, and other features, initially at federal expense of the General Treasury, and more recently funded in some part also by revenues of a tax on diesel fuel of the commercial vessels using these inland waterways. The main channels are the harbors of the United States, constructed, protected, and maintained by the Corps of Engineers, largely at federal expense of the General Treasury, but with a history of increasing requirements for substantial non-federal contribution by non-federal harbor or port authorities, and today with the additional assistance of the revenues of a harbor maintenance tax on the value of goods transported in and out of the harbors. There is a more recent history of large debate on whether to reconstruct Lock and Dam 26 at Alton, Illinois, whether to impose the diesel fuel tax on vessels using the inland waterways, whether to construct the Tennessee-Tombigbee waterway, how to dispose properly of the massive amounts of dredged material resulting from the construction and maintenance of the inland waterways in the coastal and Great Lakes harbors, what to do about large and numerous oil and gas pipelines in and on the beds of the inland waterways and harbors of the United States, when those interstate pipelines must be relocated due to Corps dredging requirements. And most recently, whether a harbor maintenance tax on the value of goods exported from our harbors is constitutional. The Corps of Engineers Civil Works Program for Navigation Improvements is historically the first component and a primary component of the Corps' multiple-purpose Civil Works Program. However, to find the purposes of that program other than navigation, I have to back up a little bit and next find the other major component of the program, which has been flood control. You will remember that Chief Justice Marshall seemed to say in 1824 in deciding Gibbons versus Ogden that the federal government had considerable powers, and it was okay for the new Corps of Engineers to do navigation improvements. But no one had occasion to ask John Marshall in 1824 whether it would be all right for the federal government to do flood control as a national purpose as well. Moreover, my historical expert, Professor Arnold, tells me that Congress passed no legislation that was directly and openly aimed at flood control until 1917, and undertook no nationwide flood control program until 1936. And Professor Arnold posits several reasons for this. First, the national government's modest resources seem to preclude federal financing of expensive flood control measures during the 19th century. Second, there were formidable engineering and economic obstacles to flood control by methods other than levees, such as reservoirs. Third, the relatively modest growth of cities along the nation's rivers kept flood damages fairly low until the end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th century. Finally, many political leaders believed that federal aid for flood control was unconstitutional. I was not surprised when I did my research for this presentation to discover that there was a lot about this program of Corps of Engineers Civil Works that surprised me. My biggest surprise was to learn that as a result of flood control studies on the Mississippi River in the mid-1800s that resulted in the publication of a report entitled the Humphreys-Abbott Report in 1862, the Corps of Engineers did not believe that reservoirs could adequately function for flood control or flood reduction purposes. And the Corps maintained this position for over 60 years, well into the 1900s. I understand that it took considerable proof to the contrary to convince the Corps that a levees-only policy for flood control was ill-advised, and thereby today to enable me to talk with you about a national program of flood control that certainly will include levees and flood walls and floodways and large channelization, but will also comprehend a large national network of flood control reservoirs. Be that as it will be, flood control was a relatively late arrival as a companion to the Corps of Engineers program of navigation improvements, because well into the 1900s and prior to the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which is the Federal Income Tax Amendment, the federal government had scarce revenues to spend for flood control. Flooding may not have been viewed as a problem. Local levees were thought to be the only effective flood control structures, imperfect as those local levees nonetheless often proved to be, and the federal government had no legal basis to engage in solutions to local problems like floods. It is an ill wind that will blow no good for purposes of this presentation, and it did flood. I understand that it flooded a lot on the Mississippi then as it does now. Local interests put a lot of local funding and local efforts into local flood control levees on the Mississippi that proved to be too weak and too little in extent to accomplish their purpose. Moreover, in the 1800s, well into the early 1900s, suspicions abounded outside the Mississippi River area that the Corps of Engineers' effort at improving navigation on the Mississippi comprehended flood control as well for local residents and their lands. One man's levee to improve navigation might be viewed as another man's levee to control floods. If so, and in any instance, federal flood control efforts of the Corps of Engineers were authorized with the passage of the Flood Control Act of 1917, limited to the lower Mississippi River and to the Sacramento River in California. And with the passage in 1928 of the beginnings of the great flood control efforts on the lower Mississippi, pursuant to a report titled Project for Control of Floods in the Alluvial Valley of the Mississippi River and Tributaries, by levees and channel rectifications. The Sacramento River was reported to have been devastated by special circumstances of hydraulic mining in California. And please remember that the Mississippi River was our national highway, sort of federal property, where money and authority could often be found when they were lacking for solutions elsewhere in the nation. And there still was no national program of flood control to be carried out by the Corps of Engineers or any other federal agency well into the 1930s, for want of federal will, federal means, and federal authority. But also, please remember that it will be an ill wind that blows no good for purposes of this presentation. I understand that by the late 1900s, lots of people and their property were in harm's way of devastating flooding in lots of places other than just on the Mississippi River. And the floods came, and then sometimes came right back again to repeat their devastation. And of course, there was another devastating national event in the 1930s that came to be known as the Great Depression. There was flood devastation, an increasing public demand for national flood control efforts, a Congress that continued to be reluctant or seemed to be unable to provide flood control. There was general economic devastation, and the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where it was proving to be all right to spend federal money to employ people and fix things toward the goal of national economic recovery. It seems that two tracks emerged with regard to national flood control in the early 1930s, and the Corps of Engineers was on both tracks, when one track resulted in the enactment of the Flood Control Act of 1936. Efforts within the Roosevelt administration were one track. The Roosevelt administration employed thinkers who tried to arrive at brilliant solutions to all sorts of national problems. Flood control seemed to become a part of larger solutions for basin-wide development of waterways as considered by the Roosevelt administration, and to be studied by interagency task forces and special presidential commissions. Flooding may have been viewed as a problem for federal solution, but not the only problem, certainly. And the flooding solution would best be synchronized with other solutions for problems like the generation of hydroelectricity, soil conservation, and other related land uses. The Corps of Engineers was a player in these administration planning efforts, but not the only player, and undoubtedly not considered the most important in the administration's hierarchy. These planning efforts of the Roosevelt administration seem to me to perhaps have been brilliant and far-sighted, but they seem to be going nowhere, at least with regard to national flood control. It seemed that these administration planning efforts were almost planning simply for planning's sake, not to be shared or trusted with the Congress, and as if there was the hope that these efforts might somehow result in solutions on their own volition, without the assistance of the Congress. Efforts within the Congress toward national flood control were, of course, the other track toward the enactment of the Flood Control Act of 1936. The representatives and senators in Congress who had assumed responsibility for enactment of a national flood control program in the early 1930s had serious problems. Their early efforts to enact a program lacked suitable preparation and discipline and suffered embarrassing defeat in congressional debate about pork barrel and ill-advised extensions of unauthorized federal power. As I just mentioned, senior officials in the Roosevelt administration were planning for water resources development, but did not seem to be moving in that direction to afford the Congress any assistance that the Congress could shape in a useful bill capable of enactment. President Roosevelt himself was, of course, very busy on lots of subjects, and while he may not have provided much specific assistance on flood control, he had posited a federal government where it was all right to spend federal money to help people in distress and to fix things. It also happened to be that 1936 was an election year for the presidency, as well as for the Congress. Please also remember that it will be an ill wind that blows no good for purposes of this presentation. I understand that it started to rain on March 9th, 1936 across the Northeast, and it rained extraordinarily, at the same time that there was an extraordinary amount of snowmelt from the previous winter's accumulation. The total quantity of resultant water that had to be disposed of ranged between 10 to 30 inches, and its disposal came to be known as the Great Northeastern Floods of March 1936. With severe and widespread impacts in New England, Roosevelt's home state of New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, and onward to Washington, D.C., where all the Potomac riverfront parks were covered by dirty water. The Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument had to be sandbagged, and the American Red Cross's administration of national flood relief was threatened because its D.C. headquarters building was in danger of being flooded. The New York Times stated in an editorial on March 22, 1936, "As of yet, there are no adequate plans for the prevention of floods and for associated utilization of excess water. If the floods have taught us anything, it is the need for something more than a dam here and a storage reservoir there. We must think of drainage areas embracing the whole country." Accordingly, the American public wanted a national flood control program in 1936. It was a big issue in that election year. The time was right, if not overdue, for the enactment of a national flood control program, but the Congress seemed to have no credible program to offer. I wonder if we could find someone to help these beleaguered congressmen to come up with an appropriate flood control program back there in 1936. I have previously stated that I believe that the Corps of Engineers and the Congress have had generally a good and special relationship, beginning in the 1800s, where the Congress trusts the Corps as an apolitical, highly efficient, well-trained, and disciplined agency that is willing to listen to and respond to the Congress, and that would carry out the wishes of Congress when properly expressed. In 1936, Congress entered into extensive discussions concerning flood control with the Corps of Engineers under the leadership of Major General Edward M. Markham, Chief of Engineers, who appears to have been the right person in the right place at the right time. General Markham and the Congress also had the particular assistance of an Army captain named Lucius D. Clay, who was to continue to have a remarkable future in the Army, and later as General Lucius D. Clay in the administration and recovery of Germany after World War II. The Congress asked the Corps of Engineers for assistance in establishing a national flood control program in 1936, and General Markham and Captain Clay were ready with what the Congress needed. 11 years earlier, in 1925, the House Rivers and Harbors Committee had suggested that the federal government examine the cost for a detailed survey of the navigable waters of the United States and report back to Congress with that cost estimate. The Corps of Engineers replied to Congress's request in 1926 that the Corps could survey more than 180 rivers and their tributaries for $7.3 million. That reply of the Corps of Engineers was published as House Document 308 of the 69th Congress. The Congress was favorably impressed and began to fund the surveys that the Corps had suggested. The resulting reports of survey thereafter came to be known as 308 reports. Anyone who knows the term 308 reports as a result of this presentation knows the origins of many of the Corps of Engineers civil works projects over the past 60 years and gets a gold star if they remember this fact. General Markham and Captain Clay, therefore, could present to requesting congressmen in 1936 a report prepared by the Corps of Engineers entitled Projects for the Development of Rivers and Harbors, summarized from reports by the Corps of Engineers to Congress. This report was then commonly called the Green Book and listed 1,600 potential projects for flood control, navigation, irrigation, and hydroelectric power at an estimated total cost of $8 billion. Most of these project recommendations resulted from the 308 reports. These projects also provided ample evidence that the Corps of Engineers had come to believe in reservoirs for flood control. The Congress selected from this list of Corps of Engineers recommendations flood control projects with favorable cost-benefit ratios attributable to flood control, and then added a few more projects for the then devastated Northeast, all at the estimated cost of $400 to $500 million. All proposed reservoirs with significant hydroelectric power benefits were excluded from the proposal, and no hydropower was to be developed at the projects proposed, although the bill would allow the construction of hydroelectric infrastructures, the so-called penstocks, at flood control dams having hydroelectric potential. In the event that the addition of hydropower at the dams was later authorized. I will talk more about hydropower later in this presentation. Suffice it for the moment to note that there was no hydropower authorized for development by the Corps of Engineers at its flood control projects in 1936. But what about the long-standing concerns that national flood control would be unconstitutional? I noted earlier that Thomas Jefferson advocated that each branch of the federal government should judge for itself its own sphere of action. And his nemesis, John Marshall, had opined that the enumerated powers of the federal government were broad in scope. Well, the Congress took the best of this advice from these disparate gentlemen and brought it together in a declaration of policy in Section 1 of the Flood Control Act of 1936. Congress decided the constitutional issues of national flood control and decided them on broad, multiple assertions of power. Congress declared that destructive floods are a threat to commerce between states. They impair and obstruct navigation, and that flood control is a proper activity of the federal government in cooperation with states and their political subdivisions and localities in the interest of the general welfare. Therefore, protecting commerce in general, protecting navigation in particular, and providing for the general welfare were good enough powers for national flood control in 1936 and have remained good enough to the present. But what about the concerns that a national flood control program would result in unjustified and ill-advised pork barrel projects? The Congress addressed these concerns by also specifying in its 1936 Declaration of Flood Control Policy that federal flood control projects should be only those projects where the benefits to whomsoever they may accrue are in excess of the estimated costs, and if the lives and social security of people are otherwise adversely affected. Congress further specified that such federally justified flood control projects would only be constructed if states or local governments agreed to support the projects at significant non-federal expense and specifically provide cooperation that came to be known as the ABCs of local cooperation. A, provide without cost to the United States all lands, easements, and rights-of-way necessary for the construction of the project. B, hold and save the United States free from damages due to the construction works. And C, maintain and operate all the works after completion. Then, to further ensure the integrity of the federal flood control projects, Congress provided that the project should be under the jurisdiction of and prosecuted by the War Department, under the direction of the Secretary of War and the supervision of the Chief of Engineers. The Flood Control Act of 1936 was enacted by Congress and then sent to the President on June 15, 1936, for his approval. President Roosevelt was then already receiving some very strong adverse advice about this bill from his closest advisors, such as the bill is, quote, thoroughly rotten. It included a number of, quote, pork barrel projects that were still being studied by various federal agencies and might prove to be unsound. At one point, Roosevelt's advisors even found, quote, an intrusion of the War Department into the picture that might set a, quote, dangerous precedent. Roosevelt was also aware, however, that the bill had overwhelmingly passed both houses of Congress, and he was receiving a lot of telegrams of support, particularly from New York State. President Roosevelt signed the Flood Control Act of 1936 on June 22, 1936, without ceremony, and turned to his re-election that fall. General Markham was also busy. With White House approval, General Markham was expanding the Corps of Engineers to address the huge new program that would serve over the next 60 years to result in numerous flood control levees, flood walls, flood channels, floodways, and yes, flood control reservoirs. Lots of flood control reservoirs throughout the nation. It is noteworthy information for anyone who may want another gold star from this presentation that the non-federal cooperation that was required for federal flood control projects in the 1936 Act was reoriented quickly thereafter. Remember that the Congress required the ABCs of local cooperation for flood control at all federal projects, big and small. I understand that it soon became evident to the Corps of Engineers and to the Congress that identifying and signing up the non-federal public beneficiaries of flood control for flood control reservoirs that provided widespread benefits were proving too difficult to determine and to effect. Quite simply, the Corps was having trouble finding the right beneficiaries with the right money to support big flood control projects. Coincidentally, the Roosevelt administration did a quick review of the 1936 Act after its approval and discovered a different reason for not liking its requirements of non-federal sponsorship of the federal reservoir projects at issue. The Roosevelt administration believed in the potential for rural electrification with hydroelectricity provided by the federal government from federal reservoirs, and pursuant to some other stories, Roosevelt had already had success toward this end in the enablement of the then existing Tennessee Valley Authority and the enactment of the federal construction of the Grand Coulee and Boulder dams in the West. The Roosevelt administration wanted the potential for federal development of hydropower at the core reservoirs to be constructed, but formed the opinion that the ABCs of local cooperation at core reservoirs would mean that the sponsoring state or local governments, rather than the federal government, would end up owning the reservoirs and the dams, even when they were to be provided at great federal expense. Therefore, the Roosevelt administration was very concerned that no federal hydropower could subsequently be developed at these reservoirs. Congress quickly solved these real or perceived problems of local cooperation by an enactment in 1938 that repealed all requirements of local cooperation for all purposes at all Corps of Engineers projects, big and small. Congress also specified in that enactment that the federal government would own the project lands. Congress thereafter determined that it had gone too far in exempting small local flood protection projects from the ABCs of local cooperation, just to solve problems with big projects. Accordingly, Congress in a few years reenacted the ABCs of local cooperation requirements for small local flood protection projects. And that established the bifurcated world of local cooperation requirements for federal flood control until 1986. Large flood control, all federal expense, no local cooperation required. Small flood control, construction at federal expense, but ABCs of local cooperation required. Since the enactment of the Water Resources Development Act of 1986, the federal government has returned to local cooperation requirements for all federal flood control projects, regardless of structure or dimension, and with the addition of requirements for local cash contributions toward construction costs not previously required. You will now be able to earn your gold star if you remember that rather twisting path to local cooperation for federal flood control. It is also very important to know that the Corps of Engineers has been enabled in one form or another since 1948, a broad discretionary authority to use its existing resources to anticipate floods, fight floods, and aid in immediate flood recovery and reconstruction of damaged flood control works. This Corps Emergency Flood Fighting Authority, together with the assistance that the Corps may provide the Federal Emergency Management Authority under FEMA authority during presidentially declared natural disasters, has enabled the Corps to be in the forefront of federal assistance during times of flood, hurricane, earthquake, and volcanic eruption. So there was an American Revolution and the good guys won. There was a struggle over navigation improvements and the navigation improvements won. There was a struggle over federal flood control and the flood control won. And World War II brought us out of the Great Depression, but face to face with World War II, where many domestic programs, such as the Corps of Engineers Civil Works Program, were primarily held in abeyance to enable the nation to concentrate on winning that great war. Then came 1944 and clear evidence that the good guys would win World War II. Congress was ready for post-war development that will enable us quickly to add some new dimensions or purposes to the Corps of Engineers Civil Works Development Program that was then in 1944 premised on its navigation and flood control purposes. An act authorizing the construction of certain public works in rivers and harbors for flood control and other purposes was approved in December 1944. It is popularly known as the Flood Control Act of 1944. It launched post-war development for the Corps of Engineers Civil Works program and expanded the program to its approximate dimensions for the past 50 years. There had been a debate within the Congress, the executive, and the other affected interests as to whether the Corps of Engineers program would expand west of the 98th meridian to the 17 western states that had been the exclusive domain for federal water resources development for reclamation and irrigation of the Department of Interior's Bureau of Reclamation since 1902. The Flood Control Act of 1944 determined that the Corps of Engineers would have projects in the West, provided that the Corps coordinate its western proposals with the affected states and the Department of Interior, and did not employ its navigation powers to the detriment of beneficial consumptive uses of water in the West. Moreover, the Corps was even authorized to include storage for irrigation water in its western reservoirs, provided that Interior managed the resultant irrigation water pursuant to federal reclamation law. This expansion of the Corps of Engineers program to the west has put the Corps squarely into issues of American Indian law and issues of Western water law, including, ironically, the Corps, in the middle of the most recent large debates, court decisions, and congressional enactments on the requirements and proper dimensions of reclamation law that governs the Department of Interior's program. This was because those recent issues were engendered by a contest over reclamation law that focused initially on irrigation water provided from a Corps lake in California named Tulare. The Flood Control Act of 1944 further provided that the Corps could sell surplus water from any of its reservoirs, wherever situated, for domestic and industrial purposes, and on terms that the Army determined to be reasonable. This was probably a well-intended authority that seems to have been little used, except possibly for small transactions in water, because perhaps surplus water is not a very reliable source upon which to premise non-federal capital investments in expensive pipes and pumps to provide the water for intended water supply beneficiaries. Accordingly, the Congress subsequently enacted the Water Supply Act of 1958 to enable the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation each to provide and sell water supply storage at their respective reservoirs, wherever situated, to states and local interests for municipal or industrial water supply. Accordingly, the Corps can and does provide water supply storage for municipal and industrial purposes at its reservoir projects in return for non-federal reimbursement of the federal capital and operation expenses of providing the water supply storage. And locals provide and pay for their own water treatment, pipes and pumps necessary for delivery of the water in a usable state to local water supply beneficiaries. You will earn another gold star by not confusing the National Water Supply Storage Program that I just mentioned with the authority of the special program that enables the Corps of Engineers, in cooperation with the District of Columbia and suburban Northern Virginia, currently to provide treated water to the District of Columbia and some of the Virginia suburbs. This special authority of the Corps' Washington Aqueduct Division originated in the mid-1800s and was intended to make the Corps the water supplier for what was then known as the Federal City. This special authority thus has a long history. It's proven controversial on occasion, and it is its own story still being written, as evidenced periodically in the local newspapers. Just remember for your gold star that the Corps of Engineers nationally provides and sells water supply storage at its reservoirs, but it does not provide water treatment, pipes, or pumps. What about outdoor recreation for post-war America at Corps of Engineers reservoirs? The Flood Control Act of 1944 said yes to outdoor recreation at Corps reservoirs. It specified that the water areas of Corps reservoirs were to remain generally open to the recreating public at no admission charge, and the Corps would provide parks at its reservoirs, or could provide parks at its reservoirs at federal expense, or lease the federal lands at its reservoirs to local governments at no charge if they wish to construct their own parks on those lands. Thereafter, the federal government took a more extensive look at federally provided outdoor recreation. And in 1965, pursuant to the Federal Water Project Recreation Act, the Corps was further enabled to recommend recreation as a purpose at its projects and to develop that recreation provided that local interests paid for 50% of project costs that could be solely attributed to that recreation, and that local interests administered the resultant recreation areas. Accordingly, the Corps of Engineers has been enabled in one form or another to provide or provide for outdoor recreation at its civil works projects since 1944. While there has been debate over the past 20 years on the advisability of the federal government's continued participation in this sort of outdoor recreation, be assured that there continue to be scores of outdoor recreation facilities and parks at Corps reservoirs and other water resources projects throughout the nation, and they support high visibility, high visitation by an American public that oftentimes, and happily enough, best knows the United States Army through its use of Corps of Engineers parks. But here we are in 1944, and we have been curious as to whether the Corps of Engineers would ever be enabled to develop the potential for the generation of hydroelectricity that existed or would exist at many of its reservoir projects throughout the nation. You will remember that this was an authority specifically withheld in the enactment of the Flood Control Act of 1936. Private power companies and some congressmen who paid close attention to them were strongly opposed to the government or to the generation of electricity by the federal government at federal reservoirs for ultimate use of the consuming public. They viewed this as an unwarranted federal intervention in the private sector and as unlawful federal competition with the private sector. And the private power companies in 1936 were still fighting the propriety of what they viewed then as a terrible aberration known as the Tennessee Valley Authority, and that had been established earlier through the efforts of the Roosevelt administration and some like-minded congressmen. Private power thus kept the lid on Corps of Engineers' potential to develop hydropower at Corps reservoirs that were enabled in 1936. The private power companies were also determined to slay the TVA dragon in the courts in cases variously styled as Ashwander versus Tennessee Valley Authority and Tennessee Electric Power Company versus Tennessee Valley Authority, that were decided respectively in 1936 and 1939. Chief Justice Marshall would have been very proud of his Supreme Court had he been there for the decisions in Ashwander and Tennessee Electric Power Company. And even Thomas Jefferson might have found some comfort in the fact that it appeared that small family farms and other interests in rural America were probably going to get some very cheap electricity, compliments of the federal government. The Supreme Court first found in the case of Ashwander in 1936 that the power of falling water naturally resulted from the construction of a federal dam. That water power came into the exclusive control of the federal government, and when converted into electrical energy, could be disposed of as property of the United States, pursuant to the Property Clause of the United States Constitution. The Supreme Court next found in the case of the Tennessee Electric Company in 1939, that a federal statute might only be challenged to protect a legal right, and that the plaintiff private utilities had no legal right to be free from competition from the federal government. In preparing for this presentation, I enjoyed revisiting the 1936 and 1939 decisions in the case of Ashwander and Tennessee Electric Company, where the federal government prevailed in the legal battles over federal hydroelectricity. The strength of the victories in these decisions for the federal government at this stage in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration reminded me that FDR's program was pounded by the Supreme Court in its early stages. You may remember that FDR then openly speculated on packing the Supreme Court with additional justices to the 9 justices then sitting to get enough justices who might act favorably to the New Deal in their rulings. You may also remember that shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court seemed to change its legal philosophy to rule more favorably on government actions. And the court's change to support FDR's program was popularly known as a switch in time that saved 9. The decisions in Ashwander and Tennessee Electric Company look to me like classic examples of that switch in time. The Flood Control Act of 1944 did provide authority for the Corps of Engineers to generate hydroelectricity at Corps of Engineers reservoirs, provided that the power generated would be transferred to federal regional power authorities, who in turn would transmit the power to non-federal public or private power companies for ultimate distribution, and all at federal rates to recover for the federal government its capital investment and operational costs of providing the electricity. I think it is fair to say that thereafter the Corps of Engineers becomes a preeminent developer of much of the hydroelectricity that is provided in many regions of this country. I will also briefly mention some other important Corps undertakings that have their own considerable history. There has been, continues to be, considerable erosion damage to property on the shorelines of the United States due to seemingly inevitable natural processes. Whether it is wise to invest federal money in efforts toward protecting shoreline property from erosion due to these natural processes has been and remains of considerable debate. Be that as it may be, the Corps of Engineers has been enabled in one form or another since as early as 1930, and most notably since the 1940s, to study, report, and attempt to try to control shoreline erosion at various locations on the shores of the United States, and pursuant to non-federal cost-sharing requirements dependent on the public or private character of the shorelines protected. The Corps similarly has been granted various authorities to protect low-lying coastal areas from wind-driven coastal floods or hurricanes, and also assists in stream bank erosion control on inland streams. So there we have it, a multiple-purpose civil works development program of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, evolving and developing over the past 170 years, and currently consisting of navigation, flood control reduction, hydroelectricity, storage for municipal and industrial water supply, storage for irrigation, outdoor recreation, shoreline erosion, and stream bank erosion protection. And by the way, if your waterways happen to be choked with noxious weeds, the Corps might even have the authority to help you clear out the weeds. But let me conclude this presentation by very briefly noting the important issue of nature, fish and wildlife, and the natural environment as it relates to the Corps of Engineers Civil Works Development Program. You have kindly allowed me to talk to you for the past hour about purposes of a national civil works development program. I think it important to note now a distinction between purposes and costs, however important those costs may be. It is not a purpose of the Corps of Engineers Civil Works Development Program to harm wildlife, its habitat, or any broader natural environment. However, to the extent that the Civil Works Development Program has threatened or harmed wildlife or the natural environment, there is a considerable history over at least the last 50 years where the Corps has learned, sometimes painfully, but seemingly well, to avoid or mitigate for such adverse environmental effects, pursuant to statutes such as the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act, and pursuant to good environmental practices that seem today to be emerging as an actual purpose or new additional mission for the Corps, a purpose of the environment and a mission of environmental engineering, helping to protect and restore the natural environment from all the progress we have otherwise made since Bunker Hill. I would now like to propose...
I want to thank the Chief Counsel, the Deputy Chief Counsel, and Mr. Allen for providing what will be, for me, a pleasure, just to say, I have here a captive audience and a certain amount of time, precisely how much is not entirely clear to me, but those are the only two things I require to ensure that I'm going to enjoy myself. Now, whether you will enjoy yourselves, of course, that's a secondary consideration for me, but you feel free. Whenever you're ready to start asking questions or expressing your disagreements or throwing brickbats, you be sure to get your share of the fun, too. But first, for my share. Now, I've been asked to address one topic only, which is sort of the evolution and development of the Corps of Engineers' regulatory responsibilities, regulatory authorities. It's entirely clear that after Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, when we began the long progression of cases decided by the federal courts, later to be supplemented by legislation passed by the Congress, that the federal government, acting through the Corps of Engineers, would take responsibility that grew and grew for all of the navigable waters of the United States. That is, all of those waters through which the federal government can exercise its Commerce Clause authority from Article I of the Constitution. Now, as Mr. Allen has pointed out, for many years, that meant primarily that river and harbor improvements for navigation were going forward under the authority of the Congress. And eventually, as Mr. Allen has pointed out, other responsibilities, most of which, once again, were in the larger waterways, the coastal harbors, and the navigable rivers of the United States. Now, for many years, there was thought to be little threat from sources to obstruct or interfere with the availability of those navigable waters to serve the purposes of the Commerce Clause of navigation or to interfere with later flood control works or whatever. And so the regulatory mission of the Corps of Engineers came somewhat later, substantially later, than those early development responsibilities for the navigable waters. But before we get into the precise historical development of how we got our regulatory authorities and how we've been using them from an historical and evolutionary point of view, we might as well take a quick look at one of the fundamental concepts of a regulatory authority, which is jurisdiction. By definition, from the earliest days, the Corps of Engineers was taking responsibility for whatever set of waters in the United States the federal government, as opposed to state and local government, could assert control, responsibility, and authority over. And that came to mean, naturally enough, the navigable waters of the United States. That concept of navigable waters as opposed to non-navigable waters as the delineation would come directly from English common law. because in English common law, navigable waters were those over which the Crown had responsibility. Non-navigable waters, no. And in England, that largely meant tidal waters. So as the responsibilities of the federal government were to be established by the federal courts and later asserted by the Congress, we had to decide exactly what would be those federal waters, which came to mean navigable waters, over which the federal government would have responsibility. Now, as we saw in Gibbons v. Ogden, we had a general proposition that navigable waters were the responsibility, were under the authority of the federal government under the Commerce Clause. But it wasn't at all clear for years exactly what that would actually mean. For example, in the next year, 1825, the Supreme Court had another case, the steamboat Thomas Jefferson, which dealt with a closely related question, which was the admiralty authority of the federal courts. And thus, it's important to note early on that the term navigable water has a number of meanings which are closely related but which are independent. Commerce authority of the Congress under Article I, but admiralty jurisdiction of the federal courts under Article III, both using the concept of navigable waters, but with slightly different developments and slightly different meanings. Now, the steamboat Thomas Jefferson case in 1825 came up with the notion that admiralty jurisdiction would follow tidal waters, was deriving from the English common law concept, which was fine, of course, for some coastal areas, but how about the great inland navigable rivers and lakes of the United States? And thus, in the year 1871, we had to wait until 1871 to have a final clarification of where our admiralty jurisdiction would go in terms of navigable water responsibilities in the case United States versus Daniel Ball. And in 1871, the U.S. Supreme Court in that case made it clear that in the United States, the concept of navigable waters of the United States would in no sense be limited to tidal waters, but instead navigability in fact would be the rule for determining the authorities of the federal government both for admiralty and Commerce Clause purposes. And thus, the navigable rivers and lakes of the United States, not subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, would nonetheless be considered, from a legal point of view, navigable waters of the United States in this continent, nation of the United States of America. So the definition established in the Daniel Ball in 1871 was that a water in the United States was a navigable water of the United States if it was navigable in fact, that is, if it was presently used or susceptible of being used in its ordinary condition as a highway to transport commerce, and that if this water body in its ordinary condition, either by itself or by uniting with other waters, would provide a continuous highway over which interstate or foreign commerce could travel. So that's the first concept for establishing the authority of the federal government over navigable waters, and we'll soon see over the regulatory authority specifically. In the year 1874, this concept was expanded further in a series of cases which we're going to trace very quickly in a very summary way, expanding federal government authority by expanding the concept of what are the navigable waters of the United States. In the case the Montello, the Supreme Court decided that the Fox River is a navigable water of the United States because of its historic use to transport commerce. So the Montello established the historic test to say what is a navigable water of the United States. If at any time in the historical past it can be demonstrated that the stream was used for transporting commerce of an interstate nature. Now, as I have said, once we have the concept of the navigable waters of the United States, we know that that has a number of separate and distinct legal meanings for the United States. It does establish admiralty jurisdiction most importantly for our purposes, it establishes federal authority and control, either for purposes of developing or for regulating those waters. And it relates to the ownership of the beds of the waters, because if a water body is a navigable water of the United States, then the beds are owned by the state, unless the state has chosen to turn over that ownership to riparian owners or whatever. Also, a navigable water of the United States is subject to the Federal Navigation Servitude, essential for facilitating federal development and maintenance of navigation for the United States. And it is subject to the public right of navigation without hindrance from any person. It was entirely clear that the United States was developing these navigable waters of the United States through many improvements, maintaining channels, clearing the channels of snags and obstructions, developing ports and harbors, that as the industrial development of the United States progressed, and especially as railroads became an increasingly prominent part of the American scene, that the industrial activity, railroad bridges, other bridge developments could present substantial dangers to navigation through obstruction of the navigable waters of the United States. This was demonstrated in many ways and in many circumstances. One interesting little historical piece that I would refer you to if you want to get some interesting details over how it was established that we needed federal legislation to give the Corps of Engineers a regulatory authority to limit, control, and prevent the obstruction of the navigable waters by railroad bridges, other forms of filling, wharves, piers, whatever can be built into the waterways, was an article by Albert Cowdery, an historian with the Corps of Engineers History Center, who some years ago, in the Pacific Historical Review of August 1975, published an article which is primarily directed toward what was at that time still a very interesting and controversial part of our regulatory history, Section 13 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. But the same article discusses the entire evolution of the need for regulatory authority. It simply focuses primarily on Section 13 for reasons that we will soon discuss. The point of this beginning story of why we needed a regulatory authority is that the further the nation would develop commercially, these commercial developments naturally enough began to obstruct waterways. So if we wanted to trace the recognition on the part of the federal government for the need for a regulatory authority to protect waterways from obstruction, we can look back, as in this article, all the way to the 1850s, when the New York Chamber of Commerce recognized that the great harbor facilities of New York were in danger of being impeded and obstructed by unregulated development. Fillings here, wharves and bulkheads there, piers, obstructions to channels, bridges, with no consistent form of regulation. So even though the New York Chamber of Commerce got the state of New York to come up with a state statute providing some attempt at regulation, this was soon found to be inadequate because of the interstate nature of the New York harbor area. That is, they did not get cooperation on the New Jersey side. So the New York Chamber of Commerce concluded that some form of national legislation would be appropriate, and as early as the 1850s began lobbying for some form of legislation of a national character. Consequently, Congressman Abram Hewitt eventually introduced legislation in 1876 to try to implement the New York proposal for an interstate form of regulation to protect harbors, ports, havens, navigable rivers, and other waters of the United States from obstructions. The bill in 1876 was sent to the House Committee on Commerce, and as was so often the case with proposals to prevent obstructions, it there lay unrecognized and unsupported for many years. And the primary reason, of course, was that all of these interests who were obstructing the waterways had strong economic power in the United States. The railroad interests primarily. Railroads throughout this period, as you recognize, from the 1840s, 50s, 60s, 70s, became every year more powerful and more influential as they became an increasingly important part of the economy of the United States. And the fact that railroads could essentially build bridges over navigable waters with very little or no regulation on the part of the federal government, with only the most sporadic and ineffective regulation by states and local governments, gave the railroads a tremendous amount of power. So even though this proposal in 1876 by Congressman Hewitt went nowhere initially, in that same year, the Chief of Engineers, Brigadier General Andrew A. Humphreys, accepted that proposal as the beginning of the Corps of Engineers proposals for national legislation of a regulatory nature to protect the navigable waters of the United States from obstruction, and proposed to Congress in the year 1876 legislation to regulate every form of obstruction of the waters, of the navigable waters of the United States. Once again, however, because of strong opposition from railroad and other industrial interests, General Humphreys' proposals went nowhere. To quote the president of the Michigan Central Railroad, referring to this proposed legislation, quote, "Such power must at all times be detrimental to some of our large interests. This is carrying centralization too far." He spoke for an immensely powerful railroad industry at that time that for many years managed to stymie any efforts to have national legislation to protect the navigable waters from obstruction. Fortunately, however, waterway interests, farming interests, interests that depended on unobstructed navigable waters slowly developed their own political power throughout the United States and thus in the United States Congress. Among the political leaders in the Congress who began to strongly agitate for legislation of a regulatory nature to protect the navigable waterways was Senator Joseph Dolph of Oregon and Representative Newton Blanchard of Louisiana. And those two looked for opportunities to overcome the natural inertia of the Congress and the opposition of the railroad industry and other industrial groups to get legislation of the sort that they felt was needed. As Mr. Allen has also suggested, there were many other related problems around the country obstructing and interfering with the navigable waterways, such as hydraulic gold mining in California. The navigable streams of California were being destroyed, obstructed by decades of hydraulic gold mining, which put tremendous amounts of sediment, gravel, and obstructions into the waterways. So the pressures from the navigation and farming interests in California to get some limits on hydraulic mining, the pressure from farming and other waterway interests who wanted to maintain navigable waterways clear of obstructions throughout the rest of the country, little by little began to come up with a national consensus that something needed to be done. But every time that these congressional sponsors of legislation would propose independent legislation to deal with obstructions, that independent legislation was stymied by the opposing railroad interests. Finally, it was decided that there was only one way to get legislation of this sort enacted, and that was to make it part and parcel of the Omnibus Water Resource Development Acts, called ungenerously by some persons pork barrel acts, but we know they were Omnibus Water Resource Development Acts in the public interest. And the point is, they had such wide-ranging support in both houses of the Congress that if you could manage to attach regulatory legislation to one of these Omnibus Water Resource Development Acts, it would finally have some chance of being enacted. The first opportunity where this actually came up was the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1890, where Dolph and Blanchard both sat on the commerce committees of the two respective bodies, and both quietly added a package of anti-obstruction regulatory provisions supported and by the Corps of Engineers. Some drafting help had been provided by the Corps of Engineers. And because these provisions had been added quietly in a Commerce Committee, as you know, a committee amendment in the last days, and this was the end of the session with a desperate eagerness on the part of the members of Congress to end the session so they could go home and campaign for re-election. These regulatory provisions were noticed by only one member of the Congress, as I recall, who was friendly to the railroad interests. But when he tried to stand up and object, he was shouted down, and this was reflected in the congressional record that I read years ago, by his fellow congressmen shouting, "Vote, vote, vote." No debate and no discussion was allowed because of the stampede to pass this omnibus popular political legislation so people could go home and use that as part of their campaigns for re-election in 1890. And in that way, with no real debate over the merits of the legislation, the first regulatory provisions were enacted in 1890 and signed into law by President Benjamin Harrison in the 1890 Omnibus Act. Now, the Corps of Engineers, by that time, in 1890, was already well organized in terms of district offices and division offices, and began immediately to distribute copies of the 1890 regulatory provisions and to make use of them, and found some success in limiting some of the more obnoxious of the obstructive works, such as railroad bridges, which were impeding the navigable waterways. Now, in terms of Supreme Court cases, an important case to cite here is the 1888 case of Willamette Iron Bridge Company v. Hatch. In that case, the Supreme Court stated very clearly what everybody knew all too well who had been watching what had been going on in Congress for the preceding few decades, that unquestionably the U.S. Congress had authority to pass legislation preventing, limiting, regulating any form of obstruction over the navigable waterways, but that Congress had never effectively passed such legislation, and consequently the Willamette Iron Bridge Company had every right to put a bridge, a railroad bridge, which blocked navigable waterways over one of the navigable streams. As a result of that, and the political background that I have discussed, Congress gave us our first regulatory authority. Unfortunately, because the 1890 provisions had been compromise provisions hammered out over a period of months quietly by members of Congress, it was, in the words of Attorney General Olney, quote, infelicitously, if not clumsily drawn. For example, a number of the provisions required that before an obstruction to navigation could be outlawed and its removal forced, or it be prevented in terms of denial of a permit, the federal government would have to demonstrate that that work would in fact be an obstruction to navigation. It would interfere with or impede navigation. This put the burden of proof on the United States before we could prevent any obstruction, whether it be from discharges of refuse, fill, piers, wharves, or even bridges. This proved an extremely difficult proposition for the obvious reasons that many forms of obstruction individually may not be particularly significant in terms of impeding navigation, but cumulatively they do have the effect of having serious impediments for navigation. Consequently, the 1890 provisions, much as they were appreciated as a first step, were soon recognized as being far less than adequate for the purposes intended. The Corps of Engineers saw technical improvements, some of which were enacted in the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1894. But by 1896, the Corps of Engineers had concluded, after some unsuccessful efforts in the courts, that the entire regulatory provisions needed to be rewritten. And that is where we run into that semi-mythical figure, Judge George Wolfe Kuntz. Now, I'm sure that most of you here, just as I do, you have a little shrine over your desk. Anybody who's visited my small and humble office has no doubt noticed that over in one corner is the Judge Kuntz shrine, where we have Judge Kuntz's picture. And of course, at particular moments when life is stressful or whatever, one can always burn a little votive candle in front of that shrine. Now, most of you probably have something very similar in your own offices. But for a few of you young whippersnappers who may not, you've got to learn of the history of Judge Kuntz, the first Corps of Engineers chief counsel, we might say, who began the great legal tradition of Corps of Engineers chief counsels. Judge Kuntz had a career of 60 years, so far as I can determine, from 1886 to 1946. And Judge Kuntz was the one who drafted the 1896 provisions to seek a complete revamping of the 1890 Act regulatory authorities. Judge Kuntz in 1896 was reportedly already 38 years old and a seasoned Corps of Engineers attorney. As a result, he had been sent to Capitol Hill to work with members of the congressional committees to hammer out the Rivers and Harbors Act provisions of 1896. And as the story goes, as Judge Kuntz tells the story himself in his famous work, Federal Laws Affecting River and Harbor Works, a lecture given by Judge Kuntz before the company officers class of the Engineer School, Fort Humphreys, Virginia, April 23rd, 1926. Here he was in 1926 making this speech. He was no longer a young whippersnapper, but yet he had another 20 years left to go in his career. Retiring, as best I can figure, is somewhere around the age of 88. Isn't that your understanding? I think he was about 88 years old when he finally retired. And people asked him, well, why did you retire at the age of 88? To which Judge Kuntz responded that he wanted to retire while he was still young enough to start a second career, which he probably did. But however that may be, as Judge Kuntz himself tells us, at 2 a.m., Judge Kuntz and these members of Congress and their staffers had concluded their long working session, hammering out the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1896. And as Judge Kuntz said, everyone was feeling relaxed and somewhat euphoric. Now, Judge Kuntz attributes this feeling to satisfaction with the job well done. But that may not have been the only reason that they were feeling relaxed and somewhat euphoric, as we learned from a later story of Judge Kuntz, which we might as well drop right here as a footnote. And this comes from no less an authority than Leo Cohen, Martin Cohen's father, who retired now and living in Florida, but who actually met Judge Kuntz in the flesh. He was still here, still alive, and still working when Leo Cohen came to work as a young bureaucrat in the 1940s. And for some reason, Leo Cohen had to have a little meeting with Judge Kuntz in Judge Kuntz's office. And this young, serious bureaucrat, Leo Cohen, was meeting with Judge Kuntz in the afternoon, this ancient, wizened little man, in his late 80s, ending his 60-year career. And when 3 o'clock came around, Judge Kuntz said, "Oh, please excuse me." And he took 2 tumblers out of his desk and a bottle of bourbon whiskey and filled each of the tumblers with bourbon whiskey. I said, "Will you have one?" And Leo Cohen said, well, no, thank you. I don't drink during working hours. To which Judge Kuntz said, "Well, suit yourself," and drained both tumblers himself. Now, this could be one of the reasons why at 2 a.m., after fulfilling their drafting work, everyone was feeling euphoric, relaxed, goodwill prevailed. So Judge Kuntz said, there's only one thing this act needs to achieve perfection. I just happen to have the provision right here. He read it to the members of Congress. It said that the Secretary of War is authorized to compile all laws relating to the obstruction of the navigable waters and to make recommendations for the improvement thereof. Now, the members of Congress very quickly agreed to add that. It was added to the 1896 Omnibus Act, and Judge Kuntz had the commission that he wanted. Over the next few years, well, really, much more quickly than that, Judge Kuntz put together the provisions that we now know as the regulatory provisions of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899. But once again, for a matter of a few years, these provisions went nowhere. But as Judge Kuntz describes in some detail in his delightful work of 1926, as the 1899 Omnibus Act was nearing completion, Senator Fry, chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, asked the Corps of Engineers whether there was any other little matter that the Corps of Engineers might want added to the act. Judge Kuntz and his supervisors immediately knew what to do. They took this House document, which had printed their original proposals, authorized and required by the 1896 Act. They changed the section numbers. They cut off the introduction at the top, rushed them over, and they were added to the 1899 Act. Now, these new regulatory provisions were really revolutionary in nature. They were the most remarkable assertion of federal regulatory authority, which I suppose the United States had seen up till 1899. It gave the Corps of Engineers essentially absolute authority over anything virtually that could affect the navigable capacity of any of the navigable waters of the United States. For example, the most generally sweeping provision is Section 10 of the 1899 Act, which essentially says that if any individual proposes to do anything that could affect the course, condition, capacity of any of the navigable waters, this can only be done after achieving a permit from the Secretary of War and the approval of the Chief of Engineers, and that if anybody does any of these things, whether it's dredging or filling or building piers or bulkheads, whatever else that one may do, without getting this necessary permit, that is a criminal offense. Not only is it punishable as a criminal offense, but of course, through civil action, the United States can insist that such an obstruction be removed at the expense of the individual who put it in. This provision, now in 33 U.S. Code, Section 403, was an extraordinarily sweeping provision. Section 9 of the 1899 Act, Section 401 of 33 U.S. Code now, gave the Secretary of War authority to regulate anything which could completely span and obstruct navigation in any navigable stream. Any bridge, any causeway, any dam or any dike that would completely span any stream could only be approved if the Secretary of War and the Chief of Engineers were to authorize it with a permit, and if it were an interstate water body in question, it would have to be authorized by the U.S. Congress, and if the navigable portions of that water body would exist within a single state, it would have to be authorized by the legislature of that state. Section 13 of the 1899 Act, the Refuse Act, was the most, according to its terms, sweeping of all, because it essentially forbade the discharge of any form of waste or refuse into any of the navigable waters of the United States, with the exception of sewage coming from sewage pipes in a liquid form. Now, all three of these are regulatory authorities which can be regulated by permit. But the Section 13 program is the most amazing because at that time it was common practice to discharge all manner of things into the navigable waters, from industrial facilities and the like, and nobody had ever thought of having the federal government either prohibit such discharges of refuse or indeed to regulate that sort of activity. Now, the Section 10 program turned out to be the program which became the regulatory authority of the Corps of Engineers from the period of 1899 up until 1972. The Corps of Engineers and its numerous districts and division offices began to establish a major program to issue permits for all manner of potential obstructions or other activities that could interfere with the navigable waters of the United States. Now, it is true that it took a few years, and not until 1904 did the Congress begin to provide substantial appropriations to allow for a large-scale permit program. But as soon as we had our appropriations, we became a major permitting agency. Anybody who wanted to dredge or fill or build a pier or a bulkhead, any of those things had to get a Corps of Engineers permit. And of course, the Corps of Engineers would only grant those permits if we had had a chance to carefully evaluate the proposal and determine that it would not be contrary to the public interest and that it would not interfere with navigation or other public interests in those navigable waterways. The Section 9 authority, of course, was invoked every time that someone proposed to build a bridge or a dam or whatever that would completely span a navigable waterway. And let me rush ahead here to point out that even though the Corps of Engineers did a splendid job for many years regulating dams and causeways under Section 9, I must sadly report to you that when the United States federal government created the Department of Transportation some years later, the Congress saw fit to transfer our bridge and causeway regulatory authority to the Department of Transportation, where it is now implemented, even to this day, by the U.S. Coast Guard. Of course, the Coast Guard has eventually recognized that the Corps of Engineers would do at least as good a job, perhaps even a better job, if they were to give that Section 9 regulatory authority back to the Corps of Engineers, and in recent years they've attempted to do so. But they've not yet succeeded in convincing the U.S. Congress to return our bridge and causeway regulatory authority back to the Corps of Engineers. But who knows? In an agency that counts its life and its activities by centuries, surely this is one of those things which some successor to Judge Kuntz and Lester Edelman may yet see effectuated, to put back together this one thread of Judge Kuntz's masterwork and return bridge and causeway regulation to the Corps of Engineers. The Chief Counsel has his doubts if he really would. Well, he'll explain this to us in a few minutes, I'm sure. Bridge regulation can be a very controversial matter. Drawbridges and such things. There are a lot of political complications. So some people thought the Corps of Engineers was really quite clever in cooperating with the Department of Transportation to get rid of the bridge authority some years ago. But Bernie Good was convinced that we had to get it back. So it's a matter where reasonable men unquestionably can differ. Now, it's interesting to ask, if since we had this extraordinarily broadly written regulatory authority in Section 13 of the Act of 1899, the Refuse Act, would the Corps of Engineers use this as essentially an environmental regulatory authority? Clearly, the plain language of Section 13 would not only seem to allow that, but, it would seem to contemplate that. And in many instances, the Corps of Engineers attempted to use the Act in that way in the early years of its implementation. But the time was not right. From the Judge Advocate General of the United States, who wrote opinions trying to prevent the Corps of Engineers from using the Refuse Act provisions for any purpose other than controlling imminent and direct threats to navigation, to the Attorney General of the United States, who wrote similar opinions. The Corps of Engineers was strongly discouraged from attempting to use essentially Section 13, but to some extent also Section 10, for any purpose other than the protection of navigation. All this began to change, however, when little by little the environmental movement began to take shape in the United States through the slow recognition that the nation needed some forms of regulation to protect the environment, and yet the Congress was very reluctant to provide any new ones, because we still happen to have on the books these old ones. So in 1960, the United States Supreme Court decided the case of United States versus Republic Steel. It was, on the surface of things, a navigation case, because the Corps of Engineers had determined that a 21-foot channel that we were maintaining in the Calumet River in Illinois was being filled by refuse coming from the pipes of the Republic Steel Company. Their cooling water was returned to this river with many small metal filings which shoaled downstream of those pipes. So the Corps of Engineers found it difficult to do enough dredging to maintain navigation at that point because of the cumulative accumulation of these steel filings from the Republic Steel plant. When the Corps of Engineers asserted that these discharges of these filings in the wastewater violated the Section 13 of the 1899 Act, it was a very difficult question. The United States Supreme Court split 5-4 on that question, but the majority opinion written by Justice William Douglas asserted that Section 13 of the Act, in fact, did apply to these discharges, because the 1899 Act regulatory provisions should be read charitably and broadly rather than in the way that they had been read for the preceding 60 years, which was narrowly and conservatively. Both with that precedent, U.S. v. Republic Steel Company in mind, both Section 13 and Section 10 began to get an increasingly assertive and broad interpretation. A few years later, in United States versus Standard Oil Company, where the Standard Oil Company had spilled airplane fuel into the St. Johns River, the United States asserted Section 13, claiming that the environmental damage had taken place. So in 1966, the Supreme Court, now with a 6-3 majority, held that the Refuse Act forbade the dumping of all foreign substances and pollutants into any of the navigable rivers, all substances except sewage coming from pipes in a liquid form. Now we had in 1966 a Supreme Court endorsement for an assertive implementation of the 1899 Act. It's interesting to note that Mr. Justice John Harlan, in those two cases, dissented vigorously, making it clear that, from his point of view, this was a sweeping new federal authority, which Congress could hardly have contemplated in 1899, and that if Congress wanted that kind of sweeping environmental authority, Congress should address the subject matter anew and provide a new regulatory authority with which the federal government could act. Well, as we'll see, Justice Harlan's suggestion for a new congressional action on the subject was taken up in 1972. But in the meantime, between the 1960 and 1966 decisions of the Supreme Court and 1972, a great deal took place. The Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act was passed in 1958 in a form which got the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, what we now call the Fish and Wildlife Service, increasingly involved in all decisions that we took under the 1899 Act regulatory authorities. Every time we would process a Section 10 permit, the Fish and Wildlife Service essentially would be able to give comments on what would be the effect of this proposed dredging or filling or piers or whatever on fish and wildlife. This began to increase the environmental implications of the program substantially. In 1966, the same year the Standard Oil case was decided, the Corps of Engineers asserted the Section 10 authority in the case that later became Zabel versus Tabb, when a developer in Florida who wished to put fill into Boca Ciega Bay was denied his permit for these filling activities on environmental grounds. It was not at all clear that Section 10 use in that way would be upheld by the federal courts. But when the case finally reached the Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in 1970, the Fifth Circuit upheld the environmental use of Section 10, saying that the Section 10 authority could be used not merely to protect navigation, but to protect every aspect of the public interest, including the environment. This had been anticipated in 1968, when the Corps of Engineers changed its own regulations governing all of its regulatory authorities to assert that from 1968 onward, all Section 10 permitted activities would be evaluated by the Corps of Engineers, not merely in terms of their implications for navigation, but for every aspect of the public interest, specifically including water quality, the need for water quality certification from the states, and in addition, fish, wildlife. Soon we had a wetlands provision in. The program by the late 60s, due to the efforts of the Corps through the rulemaking process, due to the federal courts, became increasingly assertive in terms of environmental protection. Congress had been standing on the sidelines to some extent, but congressional committees began to give the Corps strong encouragement in that direction. Representative Henry Royce of Wisconsin and his committee urged the Corps of Engineers to begin to use the 1899 Act provisions more aggressively. And another opportunity for this arose in 1970 when a major mercury pollution scandal hit the national press due to mercury poisoning in a number of U.S. waterways, including those around the Great Lakes. The Corps of Engineers was called upon to use Section 13 to go after the industries who were discharging mercury into the waterways, which the Corps of Engineers did successfully. Now, as you recall, the Section 13 provisions of the 1899 Act provided an authority for a permit program. But the Corps of Engineers' attempts to establish a permit program under Section 13 never had gone very far. Our permit program under Section 10 was very extensive, and every district of the Corps of Engineers had as a major part of its work a permit program regulating all manner of potential obstructions in the navigable waterways. But the Section 13 permit program was never funded by the Congress and never really got off the ground. One, because of all these decades from 1899 up until the 1960s, there was little public support for it. The interpretation of the program suggested that if we weren't going to use it to protect the environment, there was little reason to set up such a big program under Section 13. But yet, here we are in the late 60s with the 1899 Act, the one primary act that the federal government had to protect the navigable waters from every form of environmental pollution as well as obstruction. And so people began to say, well, maybe we should now implement the permit authority, which has been in the Section 13 of the 1899 Act for all these decades. It so happens that at that time, the Corps of Engineers had an attorney named Jacobus, or Jake Langhorst, who suggested to Robert E. Jordan, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, that the Corps of Engineers should specifically advocate to the Congress the setting up of a permit program under Section 13. This program would be based not merely on the Corps' investigation of the effect that various polluting discharges would have on the environment and on the public interest, but the states would have a major role because every Section 13 permit would be subjected to the state water quality certification because as of 1970 we had a specific state water quality certification provision in the federal law that all federal licenses and permits such as would have to go through. Now, the state certification provision was recognized as a major way of getting a handle on water pollution. So Congress provided $4 million for the Corps of Engineers to actively set up the Section 13 permit program. President Nixon put out an executive order on December 23rd, 1970, instructing the Corps of Engineers to implement a permit program under Section 13 of the 1899 Act, and the Corps of Engineers was off and running with a new and highly publicized Section 13 permit program, the only federal regulatory program for regulating the various forms of polluting discharges into the navigable waters of the United States. Unfortunately, after about a 2-year period when the Corps of Engineers was implementing the Section 13 program, Congress decided to take up the entire subject of water pollution. And it was recognized that the Section 13 program, useful as it was as a stopgap, was a somewhat imperfect regulatory approach because it was not based on what you might call criteria established by the Congress to guide the Corps of Engineers in whether to issue permits, under what conditions to issue permit, what was the Corps of Engineers supposed to do, except for the use of the state water quality certifications, but the states were not in a highly sophisticated state by that point either. In 1972, when Congress passed the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972, the Section 13 program was folded into the Section 402 program, the National Polluting Discharge Elimination System program, which would be administered by the Environmental Protection Agency. And the Section 13 permits that the Corps of Engineers had granted were transferred to EPA and became 402 permits. So at this point, Section 13, still on the books, is still a very useful authority in the sense that it is used for many prosecutions of serious pollution problems, and especially for people who put debris on the banks of rivers where it's later washed into the streams and rivers, a specific provision of the 1899 Act. But in terms of a permit authority, that's all now in the hands of EPA under Section 402. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about how in the same 1972 Act, the Corps of Engineers got into the business of our Section 404 program. And if there's time in a few minutes, and if the Chief Counsel wants us to, we can spend some time on that. But now that we've traced the 1899 Act provisions, let me go back very quickly and remind you a few more important principles in terms of just how far our regulatory authorities go. Now, we've established the first basic tests for the navigable waters of the United States as the jurisdictional basis for our regulatory responsibilities. And we established navigability in fact and historic navigability as the two essential tests given us by the Supreme Court in the cases we discussed in the first part of this talk. But to complete that story, let me cite a few other highly important cases that you should know about on this subject of jurisdiction. First, Economy Light and Power Company versus United States, 1921 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Now here the Corps of Engineers was asserting its 1899 regulatory authority because the Economy Light and Power Company was attempting, without any federal regulation, to build a dam across the Des Plaines River in Illinois. That river was not navigable in fact. It had at one time been navigable in fact, but dams, the drying up of the draining of swamps, many things had taken most of the water out of the Des Plaines River. So the question arose, is a river that was once navigable, but which is no longer navigable in fact, still a navigable water in the United States subject to the federal regulatory authority of the 1899 Act? The Supreme Court held that it was and gave us the rule of indelible navigability. The rule that if at any time in the past any body of water was a navigable water of the United States, then it will always be navigable in law. That's why we have the interesting provision in quite a few of the omnibus water resource acts where Congress specifically abandons the status of an area as a navigable water of the United States so that people can get tidal insurance and develop areas that, for example, may have been once tidal waters, as we'll see in a minute, but have since been filled in. because until that happens, there's some doubt, because of the rule of indelible navigability, about whether the United States still has control and authority over those areas. Another case, United States versus Appalachian Electric Power Company in 1940. This case arose under the Federal Power Act because in the 1920s, the Congress had asserted not federal takeover of the power industry of hydropower, as Ron has pointed out, but had in the Federal Power Act asserted a federal regulatory authority. In the Federal Power Act of the 1920s, we were told that no one could build a hydropower dam in the United States without getting approval from the Federal Power Commission, which would provide a license to ensure that all important federal interests were protected, including navigation interests, because the Federal Power Commission would not grant a license unless the Chief of Engineers was satisfied that appropriate provisions had been made in that hydropower dam to facilitate navigation, such as locks, for example. Now, in 1940, this case came up because we had a somewhat questionable stream, a stretch of the New River going between West Virginia and Virginia. It was entirely clear that the stretch in question here, where Appalachian Electric Power Company wanted to build a dam and did not want to have to get a license from the Federal Power Commission, it was not navigable in fact because there were too many rapids, rocks, and waterfalls. However, it was entirely clear that the area at one time was susceptible to being made navigable. We knew that because the Corps of Engineers had done a survey back in the 1870s and had recommended to Congress that this stretch of the New River should be developed by having the locks removed and having the rocks removed and having the channel improved. The Supreme Court took that Corps of Engineers survey report from the 1870s and said this is clear evidence, in addition to some historic use, that this area could have been made navigable with reasonable improvements at one point in the historic past, in the 1870s. And that is all that is needed to make an area indelibly and forever a navigable water of the United States. Now, you might say that the Appalachian Electric Power Company case represented a high water mark of the assertion of federal power and federal control over every water body in the United States which could reasonably be used, controlled by the federal government as to promote the Commerce Clause ends of the United States. Unfortunately, from the Corps' point of view, the high water mark in the era of the New Deal and succeeding years has met a reversal to some extent with the much more conservative judges who have tended to dominate the U.S. Supreme Court in recent years. And so we have, for example, the case of Kaiser Aetna Corporation versus United States in 1979, where Mr. Justice Rehnquist wrote the majority decision for the court, beginning to put limits, the first limits we'd seen in quite a while from the Supreme Court, on what can be the authorities of the federal government in asserting jurisdiction over navigable waters to protect the right of navigation, what are the limits of federal power. The specific question that came up there was a little complicated, and we don't have time to go into details right now. But let's just say that in its most fundamental, it relates to the last test of what are the navigable waters of the United States, over which traditionally the federal government has asserted control, including regulatory control, and that is all those waters that are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. Back to the Daniel Ball, right?